Hi there, Bonnie Violet here, a queer chaplain. And in case you don't know where you are at Drag and Spirituality. This is the Faith, Hope, and Justice series in collaboration with Glide and the Glide Pride team. This is our fourth episode of 6 this evening. And this is our late night version, I guess. It's the 8 o'clock version, which I'm really excited to get to. As everyone knows, it's Pride season. So it's like, everybody's booked and has lots of gigs. So we get to move schedules around, which is awesome and great. Really glad that you all could join us here tonight. This is kind of a opportunity where a drag show meets a spiritual conversation. And so there is an opportunity for you to support our drag artist. So you'll see here in a second that Lotus Boys is information so that you can tip them along the way or send them a little gift if you like. It's just a way of merging the drag world and the spiritual world, I guess. I don't know. It's just a thing that I do. Hi, Skylara. Glad you could join us this evening. I am the worst when it comes to reading these comments. I swear, it's like I don't know how to read. But welcome. I'm so glad that you're here. What else? Oh, so also, because we're live, we do want to engage with you. So please leave in the comments any questions that you might have of our drag artist, and give us comments and just, have a good time with us today. You folks are watching us either live on YouTube, Twitch, or Facebook, or you also might be listening to this later on a podcast. You can listen to this on a podcast anywhere you listen to podcasts at A Queer Chaplain. I think I'm done with all the little intro stuff. I'm not always good with all this stuff, but I guess it's part of the process. So hi Liz, glad you could join us as well. So let's get to it. Our guest this evening is Lotus Boy. Lotus Boy is a trans fluid Chinese American drag king based in Occupied Muwekma Ohlone Land, aka San Jose, California. He is a former Vacation Bible School enthusiast who was raised Christian, but currently identifies as spiritual and non-denominational for now. Through their drag, she seeks to channel messages from their ancestors and their highest self around healing, hope, and intersectional justice. Here is Lotus Boy. Hey.
Hi, Bonnie. Thank you.
How are you?
I'm doing amazing. I'm really happy to be here and really grateful to be here. And thank you again for having me.
So, of course, I'm so glad that you're here. I see Daddy's here.
Daddy is my first drag child as well. They're amazing. So grateful they came to support. And also love you, Vera. Also King Baba Moon. Amazing. I'm so grateful you all are here.
Oh, fantastic. It's a family affair. Glad you all could join us. So I know you've listened to a few of these interviews, and I'm really bad at foreplay. So I usually like to just kind of go right in, so to speak, consensually, of course. But I love to hear a little bit about what life was like for you as a child.
Sure. So specifically regarding spirituality in my childhood, I was raised Christian. My mom is very Christian. And at first, I used to really love church. And I've come to realize now in retrospect that I really just love the sense of community, right? That a lot of churches seek to have.
Yeah.
However, I realized early on as well, about age 13, that I didn't fully connect with the type of spirituality and religion that my mom was telling me was the only truth, that a lot of people were telling me is what I had to believe. I said in my bio, I'm a former Vacation Bible School enthusiast, because I don't know if you all know what that is, VBS for short. A lot of predominantly, there's a lot of white people at my church that I grew up. So predominantly white churches I would see having these programs, which are great, right? It's like a summer school, fun camp type thing for kids ages like K through 8th grade, I think, to learn more about the Word of God in a Christian lens. And whenever I did VBS, I was on like the theater team, right?
Mm-hmm.
So of course, me being a little queer drag performer back then, but not knowing it, I loved playing in the Bible study. And I always specifically took roles that were male roles just because I could. And unfortunately, there weren't that many actors in that group. So they were like, all right, I guess you can have the male role. But I had this profound moment at age 13. So I was like going to church every week with my mom. I was in my own Bible school study. I did VBS. But whenever I prayed, I just felt nothing. And not to say that if when you pray, you, meaning anyone who's listening, that when you pray, if you feel nothing, that's wrong. But for me, I really wanted and I really craved to feel engulfed by the Spirit that I saw people in church doing. And I remember having this really profound moment at age like 13, sitting in church and, you know, we're singing a hymn together and just seeing everyone getting so into the Spirit, and, you know, raising their hands, and me just being like, I don't feel this, and this feels not good, right? Not like I was hating myself for it, but I was kind of just like, this isn't right for me. And my older sister, they realized that a lot earlier. And I remember, so my mom used to force us to go to church every single week until we had this one big fight where my sister was like, you can't force us to do anything, Mom. Like, you can't force beliefs down our throat. And it was a whole thing. And then after that, my mom never forced us, but she always asked us nicely to go with her. Or, of course, for, you know, Christmas and Easter, you know, the major Christian holidays, we would go for that. But growing up, I would say, yeah, like my relationship to spirituality and religion was one of like obligation and one of repetition, right? Of like going through the motions, doing what everyone else is doing, but then knowing deep in your soul that this is not connecting with you. And part of that reason is, like many queer and trans people, and many people on this podcast have said, I feel like a lot of queer and trans people realize early on that a lot of organized religion doesn't like us, right? And tells you that your existence is wrong, or you're going to burn in hell, or just all these external things that you didn't come out of the womb thinking. I recently listened to your episode with Vonda Cox, and she was saying something that I really resonated with me, that thinking about like who taught you certain things, right? Of like who taught you how to think that way, or who taught you that you were XYZ, like a negative emotion. And for me, it was religion. It was the first person who taught me that my existence as I was wrong, unfortunately. So after like age 13, I kind of just, you know, stopped going to church. I wanted to be like my older sister too, and like be really rebellious. And my relationship with my mom wasn't that good when I was in high school and my first few years of college, like probably because of, you know, that disconnect in her really wanting us to have the same type of faith as her, but, you know, having to have acceptance that we are our own people.
When you at 13, when you kind of left church, did you feel like it was a loss, or?
I don't know. I mean, I think deep down there was a part of me that, yeah, was really upset, right? That because I felt like, I mean, I don't think this way now, but I felt like at that time, like I was doing everything good, right? I was going to church. I like remember I once sat down when I was young, like at like 12, maybe 10. And I was like, I'm going to read the whole Bible. Like I want to learn everything. And I like started to try and read the whole Bible. I never finished it, but you know, so yeah, I felt like I definitely felt the loss of the community, right? Of like, here's this place where they tell you they're accepting of everything, right? They tell you what Jesus said, which is like, I think a lot of Jesus' teachings were cool. I like, you know, I'm not a Christian, but I think Jesus was, a lot of his ideas were on point and like really resonant now, but a lot of other stuff in the Bible was not. So yeah, I think mainly the community is what I felt the loss of. And unfortunately that pushed me farther away. And during that time as well, I developed an eating disorder. Sorry, I should have given a content warning. Before I continue on, everyone, I'm going to give a content warning that my spirituality is really interlaced with trauma and mental illness and health, and I will be mentioning some details of that. So yeah, just take care of yourself, please, because I know that can be heavy.
Yeah.
But yeah, I developed an eating disorder that lasted until age about 21, 22, and really was rooted in hatred, right? And rooted in things that everyone else was telling me about my body, about how I'm supposed to look. I also unfortunately had a best friend at the time who was really racist and really homophobic and would constantly make jokes about me being Asian, would constantly use the F slur and, you know, talk about queer people. And of course, you know, me being her best friend, and she was also really cool, and, you know, one of those, like, all the cis het men liked her, and at that time, that's what I thought I wanted. That's what religion and my parents told me I wanted.
Right.
And so I was really impressionable, right? Like, it's like I left church, and then I became friends with this person who, she was a few years older than me, and I really looked up to her. And I realized, obviously, later on, that all that toxicity, all of those really, like, white supremacist attitudes that she held really messed with my sense of self. And that continued on into my later years as well. And it's still something I'm healing, right? We're all healing from stuff from childhood, and it's a never-ending process.
Yeah, yeah. So did you find community after church, I guess? What did community begin to look like for you?
Community was queerness. And when I finally allowed myself the permission to come out, so I was pretty closeted for a lot of my life in high school, even though I had a lot of gay friends. I had a lot of people would, like, assume that I was queer, but I wasn't ready to be out yet. So it would always be like, why do you care so much about gay things? Are you a lesbian? And I'd be like, why does it matter? Like, why don't you just care about all people? And yeah, and I think having that best friend who constantly said homophobic things and didn't make me feel safe, you know, I just never felt like I could talk to anyone about it. And in my schools growing up as well, there weren't too many out queer people, at least not out queer people that looked like me. There were a lot of, there were, like, cis gay men who were out, but yeah, like nothing, not too many people, not too many trans people or queer women at the time. So when I eventually moved to the East Bay for school is when I truly found community, and partially because I moved into a queer themed co-op. So it's kind of like in the deal. Oscar Wilde House in Berkeley, shout out to that co-op. And moving to Berkeley, right, where it's like supposed to be this haven of queerness and free speech and liberty, right? That's where I really found, like, myself and found the comfort and acceptance to slowly be more out. But it wasn't until I started doing drag that I felt comfortable with myself, my relationship to self and spirit, that I could do drag and come out as trans or non-binary, whatever I am, right? So yeah, I think that when I reflect back, it's queer and trans people who have always lifted me up, right? And given me that love and that compassion that I know it exists in religion, but I just know that religion doesn't always apply it to people like me.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so drag started, did drag start for you pretty quickly once you got to the East Bay, or?
No, so I moved to the East Bay in 2015, and then I didn't start drag until 2018. And yeah, it was something where I was questioning my gender for a while, but I was in a relationship at the time with a queer woman, and it just felt like I had to be a queer woman for her. And although she was super supportive of my drag, just oftentimes it didn't feel like there was an active like participation, right? It was kind of like showing up and being like, great, but then leaving the shows, right? And I really felt like I needed to do drag because it was like, that's the only way I could come out, right? Because, like, unfortunately, a lot of society views drag as like, just play, you know, it's all fun for fun. It's like meaningless, right? And some drag, you know, it is that way, right? Some drag doesn't have to have a meaning, but I think for a lot of us, our drag is so significant to us, right? Yeah. Because even if you're not trans, your drag is still a representation of you or a part of you, right? Yeah. So of course, everyone has such an intimate attachment to their drag persona, or personas plural. And I was really struggling to figure out like, well, who is my drag persona, first of all? And do I even have it in me to allow this part of me to be seen when I feel like I don't really have other people who, or I didn't have other people at that time who were actively either shared similar identities as me or were actively encouraging me to. And the way I started was going to a Rebel Kings of Oakland show. And I had just, by chance, I saw the event on Facebook, and it was the fundraiser for the Pacific Center, which is the LGBT center in Berkeley. And they do it every year. Shout out to Vera, who used to work there. Or I don't know, maybe they still work there. Yeah, I was so blown away by Rebel Kings in, one, just the fact that Kings existed, right? So I also didn't know that Kings existed until, or Drag Kings, I should say, existed until I came across Rebel Kings of Oakland. And I had seen drag in high school. I had seen a lot of my cis gay men do drag. I watched RuPaul's Drag Race, but you know, that show is problematic and very non-inclusive. And I just never thought, like, I always wanted to do it, but I was just like, well, I can't, I'm not a cis man. And, you know, and then I saw the Rebel Kings and I was just like, their show also had a lot of burlesque people, it had queens, it had drag things. So they've always been super inclusive and supportive of like whatever your drag is. That night, I went straight up to Vegas Jake, who's like long running host. Things, and I was like, "Hi, this was amazing. How do I get involved?" And of course, he was so sweet and just like, send me a Facebook message and let me know when you want to perform. Yeah.
I met Vegas. Jake actually used to work with Vegas in Idaho. When I lived in Idaho, we worked together in HIV/AIDS work. So your transness was something that you had come to understand for yourself before you started drag, or was it part of the process?
It was part of the process. It was in flux, and like I said, it had been something I was thinking about for a long time. Along with cutting my hair short, which is like, this isn't everyone's experience, but like, I feel like the queer, like femme or like a former femme or queer woman or maybe queer AFAB, non-binary person experience is like, you have long hair at some point, you have to cut it all off, right? So sick of, well, what I was sick of was people associating my hair with my femininity or only seeing my hair. And like I used to have just like long dark hair, and I grew it out really long, and like I would get compliments on it, like, oh wow, your hair is so beautiful. And then I realized like a subconscious part of me was assigning value to those compliments, right? And also, right, safety. I used to get catcalled a lot whenever I would have my hair out down, and I just didn't want to deal with that anymore. And I also wanted to feel more like myself. And not to say that, you know, cutting your hair is inherently masculine or feminine, but I wanted to experiment with my style and my presentation in a way that maybe society typically deems as masculinity or masculine. But for me, it was like, this is a part of myself that I buried as I was a kid too, which I didn't mention before, is that I was a huge tomboy up until age 12, 13, until I met that friend. I used to wear like khaki shorts, dirty t-shirts. I would never brush my hair. I used to like, when my mom tried to make me wear a pink shirt one time, I had a tantrum. Like I was so internalized misogynistic, I guess, because at the time I associated all these superficial things like freaking colors, right? Colors don't have gender, but capitalism tells us it does. I associated all these things with like who I was supposed to be. And when I was a kid, I had a lot of young boyfriends, like male friends, right? Not boyfriends, like romantic friends. And I just really thought I was like one of the boys, right? Until I learned somewhere along the way that, well, because I'm a woman, I should want a man. And I realized that because I was such a tomboy, I wasn't getting attention from the young boys in my classes, and it just really, you know, messed with my self-esteem. And I think I had like a 180 change of style overnight one night. Like I just like asked my mom, I was like, can we go to limited 2? I don't know if anyone knows what limited 2 is, but
I don't.
like this like early like 90s, 2000s, like little girl store. It's really pink, it's really bright. And yeah, that was like the start of me really burying parts of myself, right? And to connect it to drag now, that's part of why I'm Lotus Boy and not Lotus Man, because I feel like me doing drag is also healing a lot of my inner child and the child that, like I said, I used to be like, I used to think I was a little boy. I used to only hang out with boys, you know, do all the things that little boys do. And I also feel like my energy as a performer can be very like goofy and very at times like really silly, and also in the way that little boys are taught to be strong, and you know, all this stuff that we're taught is in opposition, which it's not. That's what I try to emulate too in a lot of my performances, is like giving myself that confidence that my younger self didn't have.
Yeah. I definitely see that a lot in your work. And yeah, I think as trans folks, we don't often get to, you know, we don't get to be kids and be our gender, I guess. So, you know, I guess drag is a way that we can kind of play with that, huh?
I agree. Oh my gosh, Elizabeth says, oh my God, limited 2. I'm glad one person got my reference.
Yeah, she knows what you're talking about. So you mentioned boy, like how did you come up with your name?
Sure. So my middle name is Lai Lin, which in Cantonese means beautiful lotus. And as a kid, I hated my middle name, which is really sad to say. I hated a lot of things about myself. It makes me sad to like look back, and like the last time I went home to my parents, I like found one of my old journals where I was just writing some really hurtful things about myself. And that was really representative of how I felt at the time, you know, and my mental health. But part of me disliking my name was a lot of internalized racism and white supremacy, right? Even my first name, which is Kiana, even though that's not inherently related to my culture, it was just like I had 2 names that weren't very common, right? And just like people never knew how to pronounce it. And I know my names are like pretty easy to pronounce compared to a lot of other people's, but it was a big deal to me, you know? I feel like nowadays, like names are so important, right? Especially as trans people, because a lot of trans people choose their own names, right? And for me, trying to heal my relationship with the name I was given and my middle name, which I used to hate, but now I revere, right? Like, especially because Lotus in Chinese culture and a lot of Asian cultures, what it symbolizes is purity, which not really into that part, but a lot of like rebirth and regrowth. Lotuses grow from mud and dirt, right? Like all at the depths of the bottom of the ocean, but then they sprout as a beautiful flower. And I have this line in this poem that I wrote describing my gender as like, I've spent so many years trying to sprout under the dirt of other people's expectations of me. And as Lotus Boy, it doesn't matter what I'm doing as long as I'm trying to bloom. And a lotus also can live for up to 1,000 years. So for me, I'm like, that represents the fact that my name, my middle name, that's like my drag persona and part of them, right? And like it was here all this time. And I just had to pay attention to it and look inward. And yeah, now I'm really grateful that my mom is Chinese, and she gave me that beautiful name. And for me, it's just Lotus Boy is representing like the meshing of my culture and like who I want to be, especially because in Chinese culture, even though transness was kind of like in a lot of deities or like spiritual figures in like Buddhism and a lot of other cultures, right? There's a lot of like gods and like people who were depicted as very like gender fluid or like their gender changed over time. But now, right now it's like, oh, we forgot all about that. We forgot that trans people are sacred and like, you know, literally revered. And yeah, it was very hard. Me not knowing any other queer or trans Chinese people growing up, or not knowing that I did. Like there were other Chinese people at my school and other mixed Chinese people because I'm mixed race as well, but not many that I felt I connected with, like even on a friend level, right? Like obviously you don't have to be queer to be my friend, but straight people just don't understand sometimes.
Right. No, I get that. So you'd mentioned that you had like, how did you deal with the I guess I don't know if you use the word shame, but how did you get over some of the harm that came your way as a young person as you were growing up queer around your friend and around the church and folks who weren't really creating a great space for you to blossom and bloom in? How did you kind of begin to heal from that?
Well, regrettably, that healing process didn't start until age 22. It was right after I experienced a traumatic event. And I've never really talked about this openly, but it's something that is really important. It's part of my story. But without getting into many details, one of my good friends had a mental health crisis. And during that health crisis, I was trying to help them. And they were not themselves. And I believe that they were possessed by something. And they tried to kill me. And they stabbed me multiple times, all on my face, my neck, my body. And I almost died. And it was a really obviously like traumatic experience and a really deep experience with like betrayal, right, of trust. And it was something that I'd never experienced anything of that magnitude before. Like I had experienced violence in my childhood and later years, but that, you know, coming from someone who was my friend and someone that I really cared about, it was a lot for me. And after that experience, because of what I had been taught growing up, which was to just keep going. Like mental health was not really talked about, even though it runs in my family. Like major depression and alcoholism runs in my family. And it was like, my mom would say like, yeah, this runs in the family. And that's it, right? So there was no mention about like, do you want to see a therapist? Are you okay? And that's not my mom's fault. I don't blame her for that. It's just, we were raised in a culture, and American culture too, right? Yeah. That kind of like punishes people for openly expressing their feelings or assigns all of these judgments to feelings being expressed a certain way. And I lost my train of thought actually. So I had that experience. Oh, okay. So I had that experience and I was also still in school at the time. I was still going to UC Berkeley. And that was like right before we were about to start the spring semester. And my parents wanted me to come home and like stay with them for a bit, come home to Southern California. But I was like, I want to just go. I want to keep going. I want to live my life. I want to graduate. I don't want to deal with this, right? Like it was so painful. And I really just tried to avoid it. And I heard you say in one of your podcasts earlier that, you know, when we avoid stuff, it always catches up to us.
Right.
And yeah, it was just a lot of stuff that I felt so divorced from, right? Like realizing that my friend was having this experience, and also while they were having the experience, they were saying things related to their spirituality. So that, you know, created a lot of fear in me, right? Of like, I really don't know to this day, right? Like what was going on for them and how they needed help. And I don't blame them, but it's still a very painful memory that, you know, impacts me to this day and is part of the reason why I'm disabled. So I think like right after that incident, I had like a whole year, 2 years almost, where I was just like, go, go, go. I'm going to distract myself, right? I'm going to go to school. I'm going to work 3 jobs. I'm going to do all the clubs. But I would come home and I would be crying. Like I would just be in my bed at night, just so depressed, and really didn't have anyone to talk to about this experience because, again, it's just something that a lot of people haven't experienced.
Yeah.
And I had the experience that a lot of people were very curious about what happened to me, and would be really like entitled to knowing. And of course, that really made me avoid it more, right? Because it was like I had a lot of visible scars that people would comment on. And so for me, it was like, I just need space to breathe, right? So I feel like both my own, where I was in my life, and then everyone's external questions and assumptions and, you know, curiosities really pushed me further and further away from spirituality and myself. And then it wasn't until, you know, I started, well, I met my current partner, Izzy, and they were someone who's very spiritual. And I started going to therapy specifically for trauma. So I had been to therapy years before, but it was often the same experience where I would just be talking for 45 minutes and they wouldn't interrupt me at all. They wouldn't stop. And then at the end, they'd be like, okay, and how do you feel? Well, I just spent 45 minutes telling you how I felt, but, and I was really grateful to start therapy at the Bay Area Trauma Recovery Center. So if anyone is in the East Bay, they're located in Berkeley, I highly recommend. They are a teaching clinic, but they do sliding scale therapy, and that was one of the only ways I could afford to keep going. And really having access to that, which is a huge privilege in itself, and finally being like, hey, I have to address this. Because what I found is that it was impacting my relationships, my partners, at the time, you know, because I would get triggered so easily by just a lot of different things. And, or I would, you know, be lashing out because I felt unsafe. Yeah. And, you know, I feel like a part of our healing process as like humans, right, is like reflecting a lot back on like different things and trying to figure out like how you can do things differently. That's like my main goal in life. Like, how can I improve? And in that note, I came across this quote by Octavia Butler, I think sometime in college, like after that incident too, that has resonated with me and stayed with me to this day. And it's, all that you touch, you change. All that you change, changes you. Wow. The only lasting truth is change. God is change. The one quote. And even though I don't resonate with like God, like God just isn't a part of my life right now, but I don't have any issues with him being a part of other people's lives, as long as you're not being hateful towards queer and trans people. But I think that, yeah, like spirituality for me is healing myself and coming back to myself and learning how to trust myself and my intuition. Because I've also had the experience that I've been through a lot of hard, heavy things, but there were several times in which I felt my intuition like telling me something was wrong, but my desire to help people and my desire to be a good friend, a blank, right? All the roles that like, I knowingly chose them and it fulfilled me, but a lot of it was external pressure. So I found that I was constantly burning out and constantly getting hurt by people, but partially because I made myself available, right? It's like I would go into relationships and friendships and what have you, just being overly like, how can I help you? What can I do for you? And then what I've learned is that when you start out a relationship like that, people come to expect it, right? And oftentimes they're not able to reciprocate what you need in return.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that all with us as well too. So it sounded like you said you were like trusting yourself or kind of connecting with that intuition. I was one of the recent interviews we're talking about was saying that intuition is that kind of that spiritual connection. Would you call that your spirituality or your connection with spirit, or how would you define that?
How would I define my intuition? Or
yeah.
for me, my intuition is my highest self, and that may not resonate with everyone, but you know, for me, the highest self is like your ideal. I mean, ideals aren't good to have, but it's like the version of yourself that you want to be, right? Your best self. Yeah. And what I've learned in my trauma therapy, and I mean, this is for everyone, right? Even if you haven't been through a lot of trauma, everyone gets emotionally triggered sometimes, right? A trigger is just something that reminds you of a bad emotion that you once felt, right? And yes, there are like trauma triggers that are very different, right? Like triggering a flashback, but it comes down to, are you able to pause and observe yourself and look at your reactions and then turn them into responses, right? That's something I learned in therapy. Shout out to my first therapist, Erica. We're no longer working together, but she really taught me that managing trauma and PTSD and just managing emotions, it's not about controlling your emotions. We can't control our emotions, right? But what we can control is our reaction to those emotions. And if we pause and reflect and are able to like calm down all the physiological things that are going on in your body, because I know sometimes you're like, oh, I'm so triggered, I need to say something, or I need to do something, or I need to, you know, cope and do this XYZ. It's really hard and it takes a lot of practice. And that's how I also kind of fell more into meditation as a spiritual practice. And I'll be the first to say I'm not good at meditating. I have a brain that is constantly on overdrive, and I just start thinking like, why am I still thinking? Why am I still thinking? And so in my own head about it. But it's something that I also know is part of my ancestral practices, right? Like a lot of Buddhist people and a lot of like Asian cultures as well, of course, you know, meditation is a practice that is just regular. And actually my mom, who again, you know, she's the religious one, she started looking into like mindfulness and meditation because she struggles with her own things, and for her mindfulness was really helpful. And I remember when she first started talking to me about it, it was before I was in therapy, and I was really like, again, like anti-religion, anti-everything that I thought was religion, which meditation is not. And she's like, you know, maybe you should try mindfulness, like this. And I'd be like, okay, yeah, sure. But I was just, unfortunately, right, that was like a really like internalized racist and white supremacist attitude that like meditation was just like something that didn't work. And like, you know, I just really had this like logical approach to religion. But going through therapy, and part of what we did together in therapy was meditate together. And then having a partner who really supported my healing and my journey every part of the way since we met, and has also shared a lot of their practices and spiritual knowledge with me. And we still try to meditate together every day. It's like not always happening. We have it on our like to-do list to like try to get into a practice together, or at least like keep each other accountable, because I found that that really does benefit me. It helps, you know, shut down the mind and helps you feel more grounded and connected to your highest self, you know?
Yes, for sure. Let's take a little break. I'm going to show like a quick little video clip, and then we'll be back in like probably 30 seconds. Okay. All right. And we're back. Quick little break. For folks, if you, you know, now's a good time to ask questions. We're about 40 minutes into the conversation, so we'll have about maybe 19, 18 minutes tops left of conversation. So if you do have some questions, do feel free to ask them now. And yeah, we'll continue to go through the conversation. So what does drag, what role does drag play in your life?
Wow, what a question. Drag is one of my reasons that I wake up every day. That sounds really dramatic, but it's true. Because, yeah, I'm just so grateful for drag literally giving me the space to come out and be myself and allowing me to do it in safety, right? Of like before, when I was still identifying as like a cis woman, I was like, oh, you know, it's just drag. I'm just like, you know, trying to figure it out. And then, you know, of course, realizing that, wow, this feels great. And like, this is the most alive I've ever felt, you know, like truly after I had a life-threatening experience, like, you know, the cliche thing of like, you really look back at your life and being like, you appreciate it in new ways. I did have that experience, but I also had a lot of, you know, the pain and the trauma that was like weighing me down. And although I was still really struggling at the time when I first started drag, it again was like, whoa, like that was so vastly different than like the way I'd been leading my life up into that moment. And like, I knew that I needed to keep doing this and that I wanted, and I had messages to share with people about healing, about reconnecting with your ancestors, which is something that I try to do often. And it's hard as a mixed race person and as someone who grew up with a lot of internalized white supremacy and racism and a lot of people who were not so nice to me. So I really try in drag to both like educate people on various topics or maybe just, you know, my own culture. But also for me, again, it's a way of connecting back to who I've always been, right? Like starting with my name, right? The name is like the first thing that you know or you're given, right? And although you can't choose the name that you're given when you're born, you can choose who you are and how you embody your name. So
it's a very, very powerful thing to get to do for sure. Holden Wood has a question. Holden says, what's been one of the biggest changes you've seen in your drag, be it in theme or aesthetic or whatever?
Hi, Holden. I love Holden so much. Shout out to Holden for being an amazing king brother of mine who he moved to the Bay kind of right as I was starting drag, and we both started like performing in the East Bay scene at the same time, and just such a great friend.
You're kind of like, you're like drag litter mates.
I've never heard that, but yeah, I agree. Litter mates. Good question, Holden. Well, the pandemic, as probably many drag artists have experienced, allowed us a lot more free time, hopefully, or at least more time to reflect on things.
Meditate.
Meditate. Try to meditate.
Right.
And prior to the pandemic, I was like, I'm a king, and I was really in the binary understanding of kings and queens, right? Because beyond Hennessy Williams, who's also a great friend of mine, an amazing drag queen, drag performer who's been on this show, they were like the first person I really saw who was doing like both king and queen and just whatever the fuck in between. Like they would have numbers where they did both. And I was like, wow, like that really inspired me. But at that time I was like, well, I'm just now trying to be a king, right? Like I can't, like what? Like, and like, you know, I just didn't see a lot of kings experimenting with femininity or, you know, what society typically deems as femininity. So part of that for me is like, well, why did I not allow myself to do that? And I part of it is like, I was afraid, right? And I had all this like internalized shit of like, oh, like, what if I, you know, don't look good as a drag queen? Is that like, you know, invalidating my gender? Is that all this, you know, again, all this stuff. And I think seeing and connecting with so many amazing multicultural, multi-different gender identity drag artists over the pandemic, because I wasn't really on Instagram pre-pandemic. I had an Instagram for my drag account, but I would always like forget to be posting my shows because I was working a lot. And I really didn't have the time and space and spoons to be connecting with community as much as I wanted to, as much as I desperately wanted to, because I was just like, I want to be friends with all the drag people, but I just didn't have the space in my life. And the pandemic is when I was really experimenting more and like allowing myself to practice doing more queen looks or doing more like high femme looks and wearing wigs too. And part of the reason why I still identify as a king is because like kings can look this way, right? Kings don't have to only always have beards and mustaches. And it kind of goes back to like how I felt really pressured to like cut off all my hair as soon as I started doing drag because I wanted partially because I wanted to look a certain way, right? And I was like, oh, it's so hard to tie up my hair. But also because of the pressure. And I feel like it's such an awesome thing to see that so many more drag people, like even people who maybe used to be really binary and rigid in their understandings of drag, are becoming more open and accepting and realizing that there's so much. So I guess the biggest change is like I started wearing wigs and eyelashes, which not that I wouldn't have worn them before, it's just I never had the time. I was working a job that I was so drained. I worked like 6 days a week, sometimes 7. And would always be, sometimes I had to leave work early to get to the drag gig because I worked really late. So yeah, I just wasn't giving myself the proper time and space that I deserved to explore this and to really create as my full self.
Yeah. And how much do you think your like gender identity played into that identity of your king and kind of that blurring, if you will, of the binary, like I guess getting out of that binary of the kingness? Did your personal gender play a role in that, do you think?
I guess so. I mean, I've now come to a place where I identify as trans, and I also identify as non-binary and just fluid in general, because everything is fluid. Sexuality is fluid. Gender is fluid. And I feel like, yeah, like kind of moving into a space where I wanted to really like address myself and my internalized femphobia is what I would call that, right? Of like my childhood of like, oh, well, I'm a king now. I've cut my hair short. Now I have to dress masculine. Now I have to be a butch lesbian. Like, seriously, I was like, okay, like now I look a certain way. Do I have to, you know, is this now who I am? And yeah, really realizing that it's like I had a lot of internalized misogyny and stuff I needed to work out. And I love dressing up. I love wearing wigs, but I didn't allow myself to wear them for so long because of everything that I thought, right? Which is so silly. In my personal style, I've always had a style that is like drag. Like, honestly, I've only probably like bought things specifically for drag like 5 times, but a lot of my clothes are really like are thrifted. So I have a lot of like funky blazers and like jackets, and I love fun patterns. So I was like, well, I already got the wardrobe. Now I just gotta learn how to do wigs and eyelashes.
Right. I was a bearded queen when I first started doing drag. So
yeah, I scrolled back on your Instagram.
Yeah, so removing it about a year ago was, you know, it was kind of a thing. And I just related to a little bit of what you were saying there. But we do have some really great questions. King Baba Moon asks, how would you define your own drag traditions?
Ooh. I don't know. I think I'm still figuring that out because unfortunately my disabilities just really get in the way of me being able to create in my full capacity. And it's something that's a constant process of acceptance, especially because in the past 2-3 years, like since I started drag, a lot of my health conditions have gotten worse. And it's just, you know, trying to deal with what is my new capacity, but also like not pushing myself because I really want to do something and because I know how much drag means to me and what it brings to me and what I can bring to other people. So it's really hard, unfortunately, for me to have a tradition because I know sometimes I just don't have capacity to follow it. I wish I did, but I think one, just like maybe not a tradition, but I try to make my drag look a little bit different every time. And I said that to Bonnie right before we started this live, that I really enjoy her drag too, because I see that her looks are very diverse and always has a different, sometimes homemade wig, like this gorgeous homemade foam, you said packing foam wig. And I just try to challenge people's expectations of what is a king, is a queen if you become a queen, what is femininity, what does femininity look like on an Asian person. So yeah, I think I'm constantly trying to do something new.
Yeah. And yes, I did create the wig today, but somebody was asking that. What are your dreams? Vera Drag King, your daddy, your dad,
Not my daddy.
What's my that? Dad. Your dad?
I said not daddy, but
Not
daddy.
What are your dreams for the next generation of performers?
Oh, I just want them to be free.
Mm.
I don't think it's right for me to have, I want them to have their own dreams and to be living it. That's all I have to say. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, hopefully more people don't have to keep having an experience like I've had, or experiencing the connection of like self-hatred with religion and spirituality, because I feel like that's what a lot of us are, that's where we're first taught to hate ourselves, right? And I really just hope that other drag performers out there are just doing it, like doing the damn thing, because I know how much it can bring joy and positivity and release and catharsis.
Yeah. Izzy B 66 or 26678 asks, what is something you hope will change in the future towards how people view others with disabilities within the community? Great question.
Thank you for asking that, my amazing partner. And this is something I have been talking about a lot, and it's something that, unfortunately, I'll be the first to admit I wasn't as active as an advocate around disability until I felt fully safe to like come out as disabled. Come out, right? That sounds silly. Because of all the ableism I saw in the community. And not necessarily anything blatant, right? Not like I hate disabled people, but in the inaccessibility of venues and the lack of just like asking if anyone has accessibility needs, right? Of just assuming that, I think it's so counterproductive, right? It's like, we all know that drag is like completely different usually than who you are. So it's like, oh, you're just assuming that this drag persona is all there is and they're all good.
Right.
And also just what all the rhetoric that I've been seeing and hearing of people, just as more live drag gigs are happening, as things are opening up, people just stop doing virtual things altogether. Which is like really hurtful, because it's like, okay, so you don't want disabled people to see your show? You don't want them to participate? Or just people saying like, oh, I hated digital drag. Oh my gosh. And it's like, I understand that digital drag isn't for everyone, but as what my great friend Peter Panic said during our drag and disability panel during Oak Flash a few weeks ago, is that all drag is valid. And even if digital drag is not as lucrative or not as fulfilling for you, it's literally some disabled people's only platform at this point, right? So what I really hope is just people doing more, non-disabled people, able-bodied people doing more, especially if you know a drag artist is openly disabled, right? Like it kind of sucks to me that I have to like say I'm disabled like so many times, but I've also just experienced ableism in the fact that people don't believe me, right? Or people look at my work and they're like, oh, well, you know, you're dancing and doing all this stuff here. You can't possibly like not be able to do this. And it's like, yeah, but you don't understand. Like I have to really plan out my performances because I know I don't have the same amount of energy or capacity as the other able-bodied drag person. And another thing that I believe Bad Poppy said during the panel is that you don't know what goes beyond closed doors, right? We don't know what drag performer is experiencing, working through once they leave the stage or once they take off their makeup. And I feel like being proactive about asking people about those things, right, is just a really small way, and or stepping, like leveling up. I don't want to say step up, but leveling up and going to venues and saying, hey, why don't you have a ramp? Hey, why is your bar not ADA accessible? Because that's another thing too, is like being booked for a show and then being like, oh, what's the stage like? What's the accessibility information? And of course I'm gonna do that because I need that, but it's just, you know, it creates extra labor, and it also makes you feel like you're asking for extra stuff or you're asking for too much. So yeah. Yeah,
I feel that that was such a great workshop. I was glad I got to go to it. I learned a lot. Is that available? Can people find that online still?
I can quickly check. I believe it was on the Oak Flash Twitch. And eventually it's going to be taken off and moved to their Patreon.
Okay.
So if you want to see that on Patreon, you can do that. But I also asked them to send me a recording of it because I want to put captions on it and hopefully make it just accessible and free for everyone. Because like that's counterproductive to make people pay for a workshop on disability, in my opinion. So yeah, hopefully I will have that with captions and everything publicly available so that everyone can read it or hear it. And then I also am planning to make some like infographics or just like a list of takeaways from that conversation, because I want more people to know what disabled folks, what disabled people of color, disabled queer and trans people of color are saying and needing in order to be a part of this community.
Yes, for sure. We've got to the end of the evening, so I would like to take some time though for you to tell people how they can connect with you. You are an amazing artist. I love your work. I cannot get enough of it. Though it is enough, like it's great. I just really enjoy it.
No, I think
I didn't want to put any pressure, like I need more.
No, it's okay. Thank you. I appreciate you saying that.
But I do. I really love it, and you all will too. So do check it out. How can they reach you? How can they get a hold of you?
With respect and consent. Just kidding. Not really. You can find me on Instagram at kinglotusboy, TikTok also at kinglotusboy, Facebook, facebook.me/dragkingthing. Or if you just type in Lotus Boy, all caps, in the search bar, you can find me on Facebook.
Yeah, and TikTok.
Oh, and TikTok, yeah. I wish I had the energy to be more active on TikTok. I like see so many things, and I have so many silly, like really silly humor TikTok images. I'll one day get there, but I'm most active on Instagram. So if anyone wants to reach out or connect with me, you can send me a DM. Oh, and lastly, I wanted to answer Iachia's question of, was there an inspiration for this look? My inspiration was this wig. I wanted to try and match the purple and the green. And I was going to use a green screen, but then I was like, I can't, it's green. And I also know that B0NNi wears a lot of pink, so I wanted to kind of like pastel.
Connect it. Worked out great. Awesome. So, and then the PayPal is there as well. Also, all the links to socials, ways you can send tips, all of that are in the descriptions of the videos wherever you're listening. So is there anything else you would like to say before we go, Lotus Boy?
Thank you. Thank you so much, B0NNi Violet and Slide, and all of the viewers and the sponsors of this podcast. I am so grateful for it, and I'm so grateful that I met you, B0NNi, and I now have 2 new podcast additions to my array, and I've been really enjoying listening to them and listening to your conversations with other drag performers, some of which I know in real life and some of them I don't. And I think everyone says this kind of at some point in the podcast, but these conversations are so important because they're so few and far in between. I'm so grateful that you invited me and I was given this space to share. And hopefully people took something away from it. And my last thing is you're loved, you are appreciated, you matter, and the world is so grateful to have you here.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. I'm so glad that you agreed to do this. I think you're a drag artist like 27 or 28. I need to take care of my numbers of how many folks I've interviewed. So I'm super, super excited and thrilled. And I love doing Drag Lab with you.
Yeah, me too.
All right. Well, I guess we should say goodbye because it has been an hour and she don't do editing well. So thank you, everyone. Have a great night.
Bye.
Bye-bye. And we are out of here.